Lifelong Learning of Hilton Head Island begins its fall term in October. One of the many topics to be addressed is child abuse, and doing that will be Mike Walsh, Ph.D. Mike is the Executive Director of Mental Health America for Beaufort and Jasper counties. He also serves as Assistant Professor of Neuropsychiatry and Behavioral Science at the University of South Carolina School of Medicine. Mike, thank you for joining us on Hilton Head News.
Thank you for having me.
And you were kind enough to mention to me before we started you're going to be teaching this in conjunction with someone else. So child abuse, how prevalent is it really here in the United States?
More prevalent than you might think. One of the things we think of when we think of child abuse are kids that are physically abused. And that certainly happens. What happens a little bit more commonly are kids that are emotionally abused or neglected and those sorts of things. And all of those things have ramifications when it comes to kids' development.
What kind of ramifications, Mike?
Well, one of the things that we see in kids that are abused as children is when they get a little older, they have trouble regulating their emotions. They also have some sort of core feelings of worthlessness and trouble with self-esteem. Those are the two most common things. And the other things that you hear about are things like emotional dysregulation, leading to things like an inability to cope, impaired coping skills, that sort of thing.
Now, why does child abuse happen? You so often hear, truth or not true, that a person who is abused turns around and becomes an abuser. Is that the case with child abuse? Well,
that's a good question. It can happen, certainly. One of the things that we see pretty clearly, one of the myths that we hear is that people that abuse kids are bad people. Oftentimes, in my experience, in my clinical experience, and in working with this for a number of years, the folks that abuse kids, oftentimes it's more of a skill deficit. It's more of folks reacting out of anger as opposed to stopping, taking a step back and thinking things through. But that certainly plays into it. As far as kids being abusers, certainly kids will unconsciously, recreate some patterns that they've been involved with. We all do that in our lives. We all hear ourselves say something at some point and say, oh my God, did I say that, or was that my father or my mother? So that's a very normal thing. And so it is normal for kids to play out some of the patterns that they're used to, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be abusers.
Well, how can we prevent child abuse in the first place? You mentioned if people act out of anger and they may strike a young person or a child, maybe they learn management techniques for anger, but what can be done to prevent it in the first place?
One of the pieces of advice that I give to parents or family members is before you react to a child's behavior, take a breath, count to 10, and see if you can think about what the opportunity is here. Is there a way that the kid is there a skill that the kid needs to develop? And if so, you can react that way. What that prevents you doing is sort of reacting very emotionally, and that can help. The other thing that can help is really kind of taking the time to reflect back on, if you've just had an interaction with a child or a family member, kind of take time to think back on that and how might that have played out from his or her perspective. And that's one thing that not too many of us take the time to do, but it can be really helpful.
What about treating young people that are victims of child abuse? Is there successful treatment? Is this something that scars people for life? I would assume it really depends on the severity of the abuse, too.
Sure. It depends a good bit on the severity of the abuse. But the one thing I'm most consistently struck by is how resilient children are. And oftentimes I find it to be very treatable. And the way that you treat it is you do some skill development with regard to coping skills and emotional regulation. You do some skill development with regard to, and some self-esteem development with the child. Those are the critical areas, really, that treatment targets best.
We've really become a lot more aware, have we not, over the years about child abuse, recognizing the signs, of people really being educated that it's not proper behavior. Would you say that's correct?
Sure, yeah. And certainly with the media and some of the things that we see, we're a little bit more aware of it maybe now than we used to be. But sometimes, those same old emotional patterns come out in us, and it's a matter of learning how to, or relearning really, how to deal effectively with family members. And that's where the modification or the mitigation comes in, when you can work with a family and really help them to develop some new skills.
Well, Mike Walsh, some great information. We want to thank you for joining us on the Hilton Head News.
Thank you for having me. Enjoyed it.
Again, we want to remind you that Mike Walsh will be teaching a course on Child Abuse Fridays beginning October 12th for lifelong learning of Hilton Head Island. Now, if you'd like more information on that course as well as the others that will be offered, you can go to their website. It's lifelonglearninghhi.org. When we come back, she had one of the best seats in the house at the U.S. Open in Flushing Meadow, New York. But with it comes a lot of responsibility. We'll talk with local Lynn Welch, chair umpire, next.